Hello dear friends, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front. Zelensky asked Trump for tomahawks, but Trump refused. Well, at least something adequate. So the battles continue, and we continue to study the situation on the front. Let's move straight to the map review. So friends, today is a day of good news. Over the past 24 hours, the Russian army has advanced by more than 30 square kilometers and taken control of 3 settlements at once. In addition, a division redeployed from the Kherson region to the Kramatorsk direction has shown its first results in the offensive toward Kramatorsk. And the results there are, let's say, quite encouraging, since the advance occurred along a front 10 kilometers wide. But let's go step by step, and if we usually move from south to north, today we'll do the opposite. We'll go from north to south. And we'll begin our overview with the Sumy region. Here, the Russian forces finally managed to finish off Yunukovka. This is a large village and a former logistics hub of the armed forces of Ukraine during their offensive into the Kursk region. The battles here were extremely heavy. For context, Russian fighters entered the northern part of Yunukovka from Lochnia as early as May 30th, and the clearing operation only ended yesterday, that is, on September 26th. So as you can see, the battles here lasted almost 4 months. As for how many Ukrainian soldiers were lost here, it is simply incredible, because they constantly launched counterattacks trying to push the Russian army back from Yunukovka toward Lochnia. There were dozens of such attacks, and they all ended the same way, with burned-out vehicles and Ukrainian wounded and killed. Even Colombian mercenaries perished here in large numbers, if one can put it that way. Yesterday, a video appeared online showing 2 Colombians hiding in a tree line on the outskirts of Yunukovka in the Sumy region. Russian drone operators caught them, and you can guess how it all ended. As a result, despite the heaviest fighting, Russian fighters achieved victory. Now the question is, what comes next? Should we expect an acceleration of the pace after the capture of Yunukovka? I even saw some channels writing that the capture of Yunukovka provides a good springboard for an offensive on Sumy. Nonsense. For now, forget about an offensive on Sumy. The Russian command has withdrawn 70% of its forces from the Sumy region. What kind of offensive on Sumy could there be? Yes, of course, from Yunukovka, Russian troops will begin moving toward Kharkovshchina, but it will not be some rapid advance. There will be no kilometers per day. Slowly, a couple of 100 meters a day, perhaps even less. At present, the Sumy region is not even a secondary sector. It is a tertiary or even quaternary one. Therefore, the capture of Yunukovka is certainly a significant and important event, but it will not affect the overall dynamics in the Sumy region. Well, let's move on to the Karkov region, where there are good results. Over the past 24 hours, a meeting engagement took place on the so-called Melovoy bridgehead. Here, Russian fighters managed to break into the central part of the village of Otradnoye and take control of practically the entire settlement. Well, not practically, they took the entire settlement. However, the Ukrainian forces counterattacked and managed to retake the eastern outskirts of the village. Thus, although 95% of Otradnoye is under Russian control, one cannot yet say it has been fully captured 100%. The question is, where will the movement go after Otradnoye is fully cleared? And it will certainly be cleared. Well, I think it will go something like this, toward Dnepropetrovsk, and then linking up with the main front. At that point, this entire large sector would come under Russian army control. As for Kupiansk, there were no updates over the past 24 hours, so we move on to the Lyman sector. Here, the news was very good. Russian fighters drove the Ukrainian garrison out of the village of Derilovo. The settlement came fully under Russian control. Moreover, from the southern outskirts of Derilovo, they advanced another 1 kilometer, thus reaching the outskirts of Drobyshevo. And what is Drobyshevo? It is an urban-type settlement and essentially a suburb of Lyman, since after it comes the city of Lyman itself. Considering the substantial size of Drobyshevo, its capture would allow it to serve as a staging base for an assault on the city. Overall, the situation for the Ukrainian forces here is very troubling, something acknowledged by Ukrainian military experts who are sounding the alarm. Interestingly, the Lyman sector is held by Azov units. So is this so-called elite incapable not only of repelling, but even of halting the Russian advance. Because Azov is a barbershop army and nothing more, they only show effectiveness where the enemy is weak and resistance is low. Here, on the contrary, they are retreating again and again. In addition to the capture of Derilovo, the front line northeast of here was straightened. In total, more than 7 square kilometers on this sector came under Russian army control. An even more impressive result was achieved further south on the Kramatorsk sector. I already told you in a previous episode that the Russian command had redeployed an entire division from the Kherson region to this sector. This is the area around Chasov Yar and northward, along the Kramatorsk direction, and here we already see the first results. The zone of control was significantly expanded here along a rather wide front of almost 10 kilometers. The depth of advance varied. Here 1.5 kilometers, here 700 meters, and here 3.5 kilometers. As a result, on this sector, Russian forces reached the Seversky-Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and further north they entered Orekhovo-Vasilievka and took the eastern part of the village. The advance within the built-up area of the settlement amounted to more than 600 meters. What are the prospects for further progress here? Well, of course, the goal is to close off the entire sector between the highway and the canal, that is, to press Orekhovo-Vasilievka, and then to take Minkovka and Golubovka. But perhaps the most important thing is to begin advancing north of Chasov Yar along the line Markovo-Fyodorovka, Belokuzminovka, Semyonovka. Because if they manage to reach Semyonovka and then move southward to the railway station and clear all the adjacent areas up to the railway tracks, the last major logistics artery supplying Konstantinovka will collapse since it will fall under full drone control. And when the main supply artery is cut off, while the others have long been lost, Konstantinovka will fall much faster than expected. So we are closely monitoring developments here. Friends, a small request before we continue. If you enjoy this video, please support the channel by subscribing, giving a like, and leaving a comment with where you are watching from and what you think about the situation described. And now we continue. Pokrovsk direction. On the western flank, positional battles are ongoing, with no changes in the situation. On the northern encirclement of Pokrovsk, Russian troops from both the south and the north of Rodinskoye are approaching the road to Kramatorsk. This is the only road in the area that is still not under the control of the Russian army. Kiev continues attacks aiming to cut off the salient, but they are unsuccessful. The main Ukrainian attacks are in the area of Boykovka and Novotoretskoye. It is reported that Novotoretskoye remains under Russian control, while Boykovka has become a grey zone. The Russian armed forces are storming Novoye Shakovo. Ukrainian logistics in Mirnograd and Pokrovsk are blocked. Their forces are in a semi-encirclement. The entire agglomeration is under threat. In Ukrainian ranks, it has been reported that the situation on the so-called Dobropoli direction creates a direct threat to the Pokrovsk agglomeration. In essence, the logistical routes to Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are already blocked, wrote Ukrainian military commentator Viktor Taran. The situation is critical and requires an appropriate response. One does not need to be a military expert to see on the map that the troops are in a semi-encirclement. The leadership must take the necessary measures to strengthen our forces in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Action must be taken, summarized a Ukrainian serviceman. On the Dobropoli axis, the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to cut off the so-called rabbit ears and remove the threat from Druzhkovka and Konstantinovka, but it is not working. Such a counter-offensive maneuver diverts Kiev's forces away from Pokrovsk, whose logistics are already blocked. And on the eastern edge of the Pokrovsk front, it should be noted that positions were slightly improved on the eastern flank of Mirnograd. The advance was very small here, literally 200 meters. The fighters managed to occupy the last tree line before the city's outskirts. From their current positions to the first houses of Mirnograd, there are only 300 meters. But again, as I have said more than once, the problem of the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration lies in the western flank. If Russian troops advanced from Kotlin northward to the highway and reached Grishino, that would be it. The cities would fall. But everything there has stood still since February, and for now, no progress is observed. Summing up the past 24 hours, 3 settlements and 30.7 square kilometers of territory, came under the control of the Russian army. But Trump insists that the Russian army is not advancing, but losing territory. Well, what a surprise it will be for him when Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Kupiansk and Seversk fall. And that is the prospect for the next half year. Next, the Dnepropetrovsk direction. Russian units have achieved success near Novogrigorovka and also expanded their zone of control around the recently captured Kalinovskoye. The intensity of fighting for Ivanovka does not subside. The Russian army has begun active offensive actions almost along the entire front line in the Dnepropetrovsk direction, said a Ukrainian officer. Russian troops have transferred significant reserves not only to the Dobropoli direction, but also to the Pokrovsk direction. In particular, thanks to this, the Russian armed forces began active offensive operations toward the Dnepropetrovsk region, along almost the entire line of contact in this sector a few days ago, reported a Ukrainian media officer with the call sign Alex. Well, that is all I have for today on the frontline situation. Now let's move on to the news. Budapest reminded Ukraine about its anti-Hungarian policies. Kiev has been pursuing an anti-Hungarian policy for the past 10 years. The Hungarian community still faces attacks within the framework of forced military conscription, said Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó. In addition, Ukrainians attack pipelines that provide the country's energy security and have introduced a ban on the entry of Hungarian military leaders. And they expect us to support their accession to the European Union? You cannot be serious, concluded the minister. Meanwhile, Slovakia is blocking the 19th package of anti-Russian sanctions. European Union ambassadors today discussed the package for the first time, but most likely it will not be given the green light before the Copenhagen summit next week. For now, Slovakia is blocking it, wrote Western correspondent Jozak. Earlier, it was reported that the European Union is proposing to ban imports of Russian liquefied natural gas into Europe by 2027. Our source explains Trump's public reversal after his meeting with Zelensky as part of a certain game, which will ultimately result in Donny unleashing harsh criticism against Zelensky himself, wrote the Telegram channel Legitimate. The US president pretended to believe Zelensky, even echoing his loud claims that the Ukrainian armed forces allegedly crushed the Russian armed forces and occupied 360 square kilometers this month, a fabrication by Yermak. Later, Trump will supposedly open his eyes, but only when the situation for the Ukrainian forces worsens, and then Donny will declare that Zelensky misled him and lied, that Zelensky constantly lies in order to prolong the war, from which he and his circle profit in order to stay in power. Thus, Zelensky himself is to blame for the defeat of the Ukrainian armed forces because he concealed the real situation, although everyone knows that US intelligence is fully aware of what is happening and of the large-scale problems of the Ukrainian army. As we wrote from the start, Trump simply used a window of opportunity and exited the Ukrainian crisis by dumping it onto Zelensky and the globalists. He had long wanted to do this, and we have been saying so constantly since February 2025. In the end, the supposed victory of Bankova in Washington will, as usual, turn out to be a betrayal. Globalists in the European Union have begun to realize Trump's public reversal, which they first took as a US paradigm shift toward the war in Ukraine. The Financial Times describes an important shift. From being an ally that set the framework, the US is turning into a player on the path of distancing itself. European elites fear that Donald Trump is raising the bar of demands to deliberately unattainable levels so that in the event of Kiev's defeat, the blame will fall on them and not Washington. In politics, this is a classic blame-shifting scenario. Responsibility for the outcome of the war is shifted to partners, while the leader maintains maneuverability. European officials openly speak of the beginning of a blame game. Trump's new statements about Ukraine's victory or tariffs against India and China look like a political maneuver, not a real plan. The European Union physically cannot implement such measures, and the White House knows this in advance. Hence the impression that the US is creating a scenario where Europe will be blamed for the loss. The good luck to all sign under Trump's post is called by European officials not just irony, but essentially a symbol of departure. For Paris and Kiev, however, these statements look different. Macron calls Trump's words correct, while Ukrainian diplomats insist they are the result of long consultations. This demonstrates a split in interpretation. Some see withdrawal, others see opportunity. For Moscow, this situation is beneficial. It shows that the West is beginning to fragment, and the US is leaving Europe one-on-one with the conflict. In fact, the more Kiev and Brussels try to convince Trump of their consistency, the more reality reveals itself. The full weight of military and financial support falls on Europe, and this aggravates its internal social and political contradictions. We are observing the phenomenon of responsibility without authority. Europe is forced to carry a war for which it has neither resources nor unity, while the US maintains freedom of maneuver and can emerge unscathed. This reflects a broader crisis of the transatlantic alliance. The one who possesses military and financial power is not ready to bear long-term consequences, shifting them to weaker partners. The victory of Russia means the split of the West and the collapse of the American empire. That is the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine. The West was obsessed with implementing the failed concept of regime change, targeting Russia and Iran. But the result turned out the opposite. It is Russia that makes sense to wait for regime change, but in Western Europe, including the collapse of the European Union, stated well-known French sociologist Emmanuel Todd, we must acknowledge the truth. Europe is facing enormous pressure because of the Ukrainian crisis. Anti-Russian sanctions have spurred the Russian economy, reoriented it, and at the same time are destroying the economies of all European countries. The West, and Europe above all, are sinking into intensified Russophobia. Everyone understands that the conflict in Ukraine is lost by them. The US understands this first and foremost, since they initiated it. The Russians have demonstrated the ability to withstand the entire West. They have become a shield for the rest of the world, tired of American hegemony. This will be the first major strategic defeat of America in its history. This will be the end of the American empire, emphasized Todd. Earlier, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the Ukrainian conflict is a proxy war between America and Russia. The British national debt has returned to its peak levels of the pandemic period, 96.1% of GDP. By the end of July of this year, the figure had approached the peak of the pandemic period in 2020, when it was at 96.6%. The debt is accelerating against the backdrop of a stagnating economy. In 2024, the country's GDP grew by only 1.1%, and this year, according to the International Monetary Fund, Britain will end with 1.2%. The British economy under Prime Minister Starmer is showing the worst results except for the crisis periods of 2008 and the pandemic. The British economy is in ruins. Ahead lie tax hikes and poverty, said Andrew Griffith, Britain's shadow minister for business.